Welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel. Today we are going to be doing a meta prediction video for Arlington Regionals. I did one for Toronto, and it's kind of fun to do these videos because at the end I get to kind of see how accurate I was, and we are going to be doing a meta predictions for Arlington Regionals. I'm going to give you my thoughts on what I think the Arlington Regionals meta is going to look like and make some predictions and all that good stuff. So definitely stay tuned for that, and maybe we get some of these predictions right going into Arlington. That'd be pretty awesome. I don't think I did enough. Did I do it with Toronto? I don't know how many things I got accurate with Toronto. I predicted Beedrill would have been good for Toronto, and Beedrill unfortunately flopped, which was a big deal. I did say Duraludon was going to be popular. I don't think Duraludon was super popular. It might have been like the 4th or 5th most played deck. It did get 2nd place, so I was like kind of accurate. And I don't know, let's start things off here. The first prediction, the most obvious one, is Lugia's dominance. As expected, Lugia is still going to be the popular deck. Now, I actually think that the Espeon build of Lugia is the best way to play Lugia at the moment because it's the one that has the most, like, answers to the counters. And to be fair, there is a chance we see a big drop-off in paralysis attacks because Espeon is just so good against the Articunos and the Zekroms and all those paralyzing shenanigans, which actually really does hurt those. And then obviously it counters Yveltal really, really hard, and that's like the big thing with the Espeon. I think the Espeon Lugia build is the optimal way to play Lugia going forward, and I think if you're going to play Lugia to Arlington, you probably have to play the Espeon package. The problem with Espeon is that it does have a target on its head, of course. The big deal is that people are going to start taking in Drapion in their decks now. We'll get into that later, and I think that that's a big deal for Espeon, or just people are going to figure out ways to counter it. Obviously, you can counter it with cards like Path. You could also boss KO it, which is a big deal. Maybe we'll see Espeon incorporating Poncho in their deck to maybe protect against that, but that is something you do have to watch out for if you are playing the Espeon build, is people are definitely going to expect the Espeon, so you have to make sure you're playing Espeon. You might have to play it with a couple counters. You also might have to start playing stadiums in the deck. As you see, the Lugia deck only has Pumpkaboo. That's their only out to a stadium. There's no Lost City or Lost Vacuum. There's no Collapse Stadium, which could be a big deal. The next deck is obviously going to be Lost Box. I think Lost Box is still in a really good spot right now. Yeah, the Stoutland is kind of annoying, but with the help of Zygarde, with the Raikou, the Snorlax, you do have an okay answer to Stoutland. That's your biggest hurdle, though, is getting over the Stoutland. But if Lost Box answers to Stoutland, I think that Lost Box is a great deck to play for Arlington. There's a lot of ways to play it. I still think that the Kyogre build is the way to go, though Sableye Cramzard has been getting a little bit more attention recently, and I also think that the Rayquaza build is still somewhat okay. Rayquaza does seem to be kind of like the worst deck. I don't even think it's not a bad deck. It's just kind of the worst of like the 3 big Lost Box decks going around right now. But even Rayquaza could still be pretty decent. Rayquaza is still a pretty cool attacker, and you can still build your Rayquaza deck to kind of counter the meta. And that's why I think Lost Box is still in a great spot. Honestly, if I was going to Arlington, I would probably play Lost Box. I've thought about it myself. I actually think I would have played Lost Box if I was going to Arlington. I think I would have played it. I don't think I would have played the Kyogre build. I would have played more of a counterboxy build using, I would have had like Galarian Moltres in the deck, Drapion. I would have probably played double Snorlax. Yeah, I would have played Lost Box. If I was going to Arlington, I would have brought Lost Box myself. But I think Lost Box is in a great spot. I do think that the Kyogre build is still going to do well, and I guarantee you we're going to see one Lost Box deck in top 8. I'm going to call that right now. All right, next up, obviously we got is Mew. Mew is still undisputably a great deck, and there is a bit of an issue with Mew, though, is that if Drapion starts seeing more play, because I think Drapion will start seeing more play, the big issue with Mew is that Drapion is really good right now, not only to counter Mew, but it also helps to beat the Mewtwo V-UNION matchups, and that is a big deal for Mew VMAX, is that it gets caught in the crossfire of Drapion. Mew is just still a really good deck. Now, I don't know if the Meloetta build is better than the Path build, because the Path build is one of the only ways you can technically counter Drapion. Like, if you're playing this Meloetta build, you basically just take a big L to Drapion, in my opinion. And I think you have to play the Path build going forward of Mew VMAX, because it's one of the only ways to beat Drapion consistently. And if Drapion's going to see more play, you probably got to make sure that you have a way to deal with Drapion a bit easier, and you probably have to start playing Path of Peaks in your deck. Next up is the Mewtwo V-UNION decks. Now, Mewtwo is a really good card right now, and of course, we got the Mewtwo control deck that Piper won with, and then we also have Sanders' Mewtwo Gengar deck, which has been actually getting a little bit of traction recently, and a lot of people are really starting to anticipate that deck going into Arlington. It's also just a fun deck to play. Mewtwo V-UNION is a very scary card in the format right now, and not many people have answers to it. The only answer is Drapion, but the problem with Drapion is if you're playing Drapion that is not using Mirage Gate or any, like, energy acceleration system, you kind of have to just start manually attaching to your Drapion, meaning that Mewtwo is going to try to basically out-hammer you. They're going to start spamming Crushing Hammer and Silene to get the hammers back. They're going to try to remove all the energy off your Drapion, which is a big deal. And against Lost Box, they're also going to spam Misfortune Sisters to try to mill your Mirage Gate. So Drapion is a really good card in the format, and it's a great counter to Mewtwo, but Mewtwo still has ways to counter the Drapion through the idea of playing Crushing Hammer, and that is something that you do have to watch out for if you are going to be playing Drapion in your deck as a manual attach attacker, as opposed to using something like Mirage Gate to build it up. I think Mewtwo V-UNION is going to be a big threat, and I definitely will anticipate that there are going to be some big players on Mewtwo going into the tournament, because yeah, Drapion counters it, but it's not like the biggest counter. Obviously, you do have Lugia, which can play Drapion, but you can already beat Lugia with the Yveltal, and I think that Mewtwo is going to have to adapt to the format, whether it's going to start playing Path of the Peak in the deck to try to counter the Espeon. I really do think that Mewtwo controls in a pretty good spot still going into Arlington, and I think if you can still deal with the Drapion, it's still pretty solid, and I definitely would expect to see it in Arlington. Then, of course, we have the Palkia decks. Now, Palkia, I think, is still in a really good spot right now. The Articuno build is, in my opinion, the way to go. Articuno with the Drapion and the Palkia, it's perfect. I think Jake Gearhart really crafted the ideal Palkia. 60 right now, and I really do think Palkia is in a good spot. This Palkia build does have a better time going into the Espeon-Lugia matchup, and if you're expecting to see more Espeon-Lugia, then you have a better chance of beating it with the Articuno Drapion package. The Thornton combo is really deadly against, obviously, the Mewtwo deck, where you can go, you know, attach, Star Portal, Thornton, Drapion, and then knock out a Mewtwo out of nowhere. So definitely a very, very scary deck. I think Palkia is still pretty good. It's still Palkia at the end of the day. Lightning is sort of on the decline right now. Yeah, people are playing Raikou and Lost Box, but I really do think that Palkia is still fine going into that matchup regardless, and I still would expect to see Palkia do well. I don't think it's going to win the tournament. I don't think Palkia is the tournament-winning deck, but I do think that it has potential to probably get a decent shot at like top 32 or top 16 even, and maybe top 8 if they're lucky. Next up is Arcdura. Arcdura is a deck that I still kind of put a lot of disrespect on. I still think this deck kind of sucks, or not sucks, but I don't think it's as good as people make it out to be. But Arcdura did get second in Toronto, so it definitely still has the potential to do well. It still has like an okay Lugia matchup. It's not a great Lugia matchup because Yveltal can still cheese you, but the Espeon build of Lugia doesn't play Vacuum, and if they're not going to be playing Vacuum going into Arlington, you don't have to worry about the Yveltal at all, and then you just literally win with Duraludon. But Arcdura is still an okay deck. It does have a pretty good Lost Box matchup still, which is good. So, while it is not a bad deck, it is not a, I don't know. I don't think it's like the best deck ever, but I still think it's solid enough, right? That's kind of my take on it. It has good Lost Box matchups, and it also has a pretty okay Lugia matchup. It depends on whether or not Lugia is going to play the Paracel. The Temple Sinnoh in the Duraludon deck is actually really spicy, and I think that could be maybe implemented a little bit more going forward into Arlington. But yeah, Duraludon is not a bad deck. It's honestly like maybe a safe pick. If you don't know what you want to play for Arlington, Duraludon honestly wouldn't be a terrible pick because, again, it has some pretty good matchups across the board. It just doesn't have, like, the best matchups ever, in my opinion. That's kind of my problem with it. Next up is Eternatus. Now, I wanted to include Etern and Weezing in this because I actually think that Etern and Weezing is going to start seeing a little bit of a resurgence in play in the format. Etern Weezing did get top 4 over in Japan. Now, Japan's format is wildly different. They don't, it's best of 1, shorter rounds. Control doesn't seem to play down there. But Weezing is just really strong right now. And there's a lot of Weezing on the ladder. There's a lot of people really experimenting with, like, even quad Weezing. Just literally nothing but Weezing in their deck. So I think Weezing is going to be something you have to watch out for in Arlington. It's definitely something that is going to catch a lot of people off guard. I guarantee you Weezing is going to see play in Arlington. I know it's not going to win the tournament. Weezing is never going to win a tournament. And if Arceus is going to start coming back in the meta, Weezing has no chance. But I really do think that Weezing is going to see play because it's such an easy deck to just cheese wins with. It really just auto-wins Lugia and can really auto-win Lost Box a lot of the time. And I think Weezing is in a spot right now where it's probably going to do well. Now, I have Etern Weezing here because I think Etern Weezing is actually worth experimenting with. I really do like the deck idea. Etern Weezing is actually not a bad deck, and I think it is worth trying out Eternatus with Weezing in the format, because it doesn't seem like a terrible deck at all. I really like the idea of Etern with Weezing over Quad Weezing. Quad Weezing is more of like a high roll deck where you have to hit the perfect matchups in order for that deck to win, which you can obviously do, but I don't think it's perfect. I do think that the Etern Weezing deck might be worth testing out, in my opinion, and I definitely would expect to maybe see Etern, or just in general Weezing. Next up is actually the Palkia Vikavolt deck. This is a really cool archetype that, obviously, it did win a regionals, and I do like the deck a lot. I think that it is a pretty underrated deck. I don't see a lot of people really talking about or playing it. A lot of people kind of have their eyes on, like, the straight Palkia build, but I do think that this Palkia Vikavolt deck is legit a decent deck. It's got a pretty decent Lost Box matchup. It Also has an okay Lugia matchup, and I actually do like the deck a lot. I think that it's genuinely a pretty solid deck in the format. It's also a deck that, it's not like, not saying that it's hard to play against, but it's a deck that no one is going to really, I think, expect. Like, if your opponent's going to, if you're going to flip over a Palkia V or a Vikavolt V, your opponent's going to immediately play into that because they're not going to expect you to have it to be Vikavolt Palkia, right? And that could be a good deal. Like, because I don't think this deck is like, it's not on everyone's radar is what I'm trying to say. It's not on everyone's radar. And I think that's a very big deal going into Arlington, is the fact that this deck is not being really talked about or played much, that not a lot of people are going to expect to see it. And when you flip over, when you flip over a Vikavolt and then you bench a Palkia, your opponent's going to be like, oh, that's what I'm playing against. And I do like the deck a lot. It's actually pretty good. I think it's a pretty underrated slept-on deck. It's a pretty good deck. I would expect to see it in Arlington. It's one of those decks that I don't, again, tournament-winning deck, maybe, but I definitely think that it's a potential deck to watch out for because, I mean, you're not going to expect it, right? And I really do think that catch people off guard. Kind of like Weezing in a way where, like, you might expect the Weezing or you might not see the Weezing coming. Your opponent flips over that coffee and your opponent flips over that Vikavolt and they bench a Palkia, or they flip over Palkia, bench a Vikavolt, and it's like, oh. But yeah, no, I actually really like this deck. It's arguably better than Vikavolt Regieleki, in my opinion, because the Palkia does give you a better matchup spread overall, because the Vikavolt Regieleki is way too linear. This gives you more options overall, and I really do like this deck. I think that it is something definitely to look out for in Arlington. It might even be a decent play for Arlington, too, to be honest, the more I think about it. Next up is Arceus Coco. This is a deck that did well in Japan, and a lot of people have been trying it out. Now, Arceus has been on the decline for a while now because it does struggle against Lugia. Lugia is just faster and stronger than Arceus, but Arceus, Pikachu, Coco seems to be the potential best way to play Arceus right now that isn't with Duraludon, because Coco and Pikachu kind of check a lot of things in the meta. Coco's really good. Obviously, we know Paralysis is really strong. This deck also plays 4 Path the Peak, which means that Espeon is not that big of a deal because you can just go Path Marnie or Roxanne, Coco VMAX, paralyze your opponent. You also have the Pikachu Parasol package, which is really good against Lost Box and really good against a lot of decks in general. And the deck is also very heavy on the disruption. As you see, there is also 2 copies of Temple Sinnoh. This is one of the only decks I've ever seen that plays like 6 different stadiums. Usually you'll see 3 or 4 in a deck, not 6, but this deck does happen to play 6 stadiums, which is wild. And I actually would potentially look out for this deck. This is another deck that could sneak under the radar. Not a popular deck, but a deck that a few people might play and get day 2 with, or even do pretty well with. Something you do have to watch out for. I think the Path Coco package is really good into the Lugia matchup. Even if they have the Espeon, you still have the Path. The double Parasol Pikachu is really good too. You just have to get over the hurdle of your Arceus getting KO'd early on by a Lugia cheese or something. So it's not perfect, but if this deck can kind of set up its board and set up a Coco, it's probably a decent deck. And with the amount of like heavy like disruption it has, I think that it is legit a threat. So definitely keep your eye out on this deck in Arlington. Next up we have is Mewtwo Gengar, the Sander deck. This deck is getting a lot of attention right now. A lot of people like it. Now, do people like it because it's a legit good deck in the meta, or is it just because it's a really cool idea that is fun to play? I think it kind of blurs the line between the two. However, I think a lot of people are kind of talking about this deck and saying that, okay, this is actually something to watch out for. It's a good deck. If it sets up the Mewtwo and the kind of Gengar setup, it's actually really hard to beat. It's a very scary deck. Again, the problem with this deck is that it does run the risk of Drapion. I will say, though, this deck might have a better time into Drapion over the Control build. Well, actually, no, the Control build has a better time into Drapion. This build, not so much. But I do think this deck has potential, and it's something to watch out for. And I think a few people are going to play it and bring it because it's a really cool deck to play. It's a really cool deck. One of the coolest decks in the format, to be honest with you. But is it better than the Control build? I would argue no, but I still think this deck is kind of scary regardless. It's a very scary deck to play against. If it does set up that, you know, kind of checkmate scenario, I think this deck can be very hard to beat and almost, like, impossible to beat. You can't beat the Gengar heal loop at all. So definitely keep your eye out on this Gengar Mewtwo deck. I just want to include it because I think people will play it. Honestly, it has a shot at making day 2. Someone's going to make day 2 of this deck just because it's just that cool of a deck. And even though Drapion might see a resurgence of popularity, I still think this deck is good. And if people kind of figure out a way to beat Drapion, I think this deck legit could be kind of decent. So I want to include it. And then finally, I got Regis. I had to include Regis. Regis has fallen off recently. However, because it won in Japan, I think a lot of people are now back on Regis' attention. Lugia's been cutting the Dunsparce. They still have the Manaphy, but not the Dunsparce. And that is really good for this deck. Not to mention, Regis is still great in general. There's a lot of good matchups that it has right now. It does have its bad matchups. I think Regis obviously gets bodied pretty hard by Mewtwo V-UNION. Unless you go Path Regis, the Mewtwo matchup is pretty difficult. I think if they get the Mewtwo out, it's pretty hard to stop. And obviously, Arc Duraludon is a little tough too, because you have to have your path at the right moment in order to stop Arc Dura. And even the Lugia matchup, depending on what Lugia build you're playing against, if you're playing against the Espeon build, it's fine if they don't have Dunsparce. But if you're playing against a Lugia deck with Collapse, Dunsparce, Manaphy, the matchup is going to be a little difficult and a little hard to beat. But it does have a decent matchup against some Lost Box decks. So, I don't know. I think Regis is pretty good right now. And honestly, hey, you know what? If people want to play that Weezing E-turn deck, I think this deck could be good into that matchup. Though I don't think this deck actually beats Quad Weezing because they can literally run you out of energy before you even set up. So, that's probably a big deal. But, no, I think Regis is pretty good. And I would honestly consider playing it for Arlington myself. I just would say that because I'm a huge fan of Regis, but I think Regis has a potential chance to do well because I think a lot of people are now starting to not respect Regis as much, and that lets Regis do well. Once people respect Regis, Regis starts getting worse, but when people stop respecting it and people start respecting other threats like Mewtwo or Lost Box or Control, that's when Regis starts to go back up in stonks. So I think we might see a couple Regis. Honestly, I think there will be a Reggie in top 8 in Arlington. I'm going to make that prediction right now. There will be a Reggie in top 8. Some of my big predictions are we're going to see a Mewtwo V-UNION in top 8, a Reggie in top 8, Lugia Espeon in top 8, and I also think we are going to see a Lost Box deck in top 8. I think it's going to be the Kyogre build of Lost Box 2. So that's my predictions for Arlington Regionals. Let me know what your predictions are down below. I would love to hear what you all think. I'm excited for Arlington. I'm going to probably be watching it and chilling in the Twitch chat and stuff when I get the time to. But that'll be it for me. If y'all enjoyed the video here on the second channel, make sure to leave a like in the video. If you're new to the channel, subscribe down below so you never miss an upload here on the second channel for the extra LDF content. And that'll be it for me. Thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed my meta predictions for Arlington, and I will catch you all on another video. Bye-bye.